Okay, so I think we'll actually get started here. So about 5 minutes past the hour. Good morning and afternoon to you all. Thank you for joining us. We've got a joint webinar between us, Ashling Partners, and also UiPath to talk about using the UiPath Test Suite and kind of introducing the overall functionality. One quick kind of introduction in terms for Ashling Partners. So we are a consulting firm. We are partners with UiPath. And primarily what we do is we educate, we build automations, but probably more importantly, we're in this model for improving, sustaining, and iterating, which is one of the main reasons why we hold webinars like this one today, is to really drive overall awareness for emergent solutions and concepts that are coming out and being introduced here with UiPath. So we've got a couple speakers here with us today. Maybe a quick introduction of myself. My name is Kevin Huggard. I'm actually the Vice President of Intelligent Automation here at Ashling Partners, and then also the Principal Solution Architect, working with primarily our larger partners and clients to implement process automations and machine learning models. We do have two other folks joining us. One is Evan Bruns, who is the Senior Presales Engineer and also Test Suite SME, and we'll be covering a little bit more of kind of the demonstration of the UiPath Test Suite. And then we also have Matt, who is the Product Marketing Lead and also the UiPath Test Suite lead for UiPath. So in terms of an agenda today, so we're going to be kind of talking through, I'll go through some perspective of how we look at enterprise level automation programs, and really kind of do a double click into how testing plays a part in that overall automation sequence. And then we'll dive a little bit deeper into the test suite itself and obviously do a little bit more of a demonstration there. And then try to save some time for any type of question and answers that we have. So maybe kind of starting with the automation process itself, we have a sequence of steps or stages that we go through when we look at automations. We move through a planning phase into design. Once we've designed an automation, eventually we get into the build. And then from the build, we go train, test, and then move into production, and then eventually move into sustain. The interesting piece is, even though it looks like it's all on the same level, the effort, the overall effort of the automation process for each step really varies. And for those that are familiar with more kind of lean design and lean concepts, right? Obviously, level loading, stabilizing the effort between each of these stages actually helps to bring a little bit more of process harmony, which is where kind of this testing sequence can kind of come in here. So if we start to kind of look at the overall effort for each one of these stages, we do kind of hit different peaks and valleys and kind of rolling hills throughout the process from start to finish. And not only is it effort concentrated between one individual, but we're also talking about groups of individuals. So the slide that really the concentration that we're looking at today and talking about today really has to do with moving from development, testing, building into production and eventually support, which I want to kind of bring our attention to. There's quite a few roles and people involved in stages 3, 4, and 5 here. which is driving even more importance for kind of that coordination between those steps and stages. If we were to double click a little bit deeper into the testing, how testing plays a part into this overall effort, we would see that there's really three primary pieces or points in time where testing plays a part and has a factor. The first stage is really during build, where we're doing, the developer specifically is doing a lot of short cycle testing, and it's really kind of asking the questions of, are my connections working? Am I getting the value? Is it being returned back? So if I'm bumping up against the database or hitting an API, is information feeding into the process correctly? And if I have any calculations, are those calculations being constructed correctly? So we kind of call this short cycle testing within that build phase that happens typically just within the developer themselves. The second point that really testing hits the factor, obviously, is during the testing phase. This is obviously larger testing levels where we're doing both user and end user testing, or excuse me, unit and end user testing. And we're trying to answer several different questions at this stage, right? So is the automation working? If we're having exceptions, are they being handled correctly, and are we really hitting that desired outcome that was inherently at the design of the process itself? This gets really interesting from not only the side of the effort, but also has a lot of people involved at this stage and step. Typically, we have individuals from the business that are supporting testing data and working to accept end user testing. But we also have people within disciplines of the IT side that are making sure that we're following certain standards and protocols. And obviously, the third stage here is where we're hitting into kind of a troubleshooting stage during sustain. So we have a process that we've created, that we've automated, that we put out into production, and as it's running, we may be having some issues. Maybe the environment or the application changed, and obviously, this is where kind of that testing side starts to apply. The reason we're kind of laying this out is as Evan and Matt get a little bit deeper into the introduction of this is we just wanted to provide some orientation around where we're seeing some of these testing challenges within the overall automation process and really how this kind of plugs in to the enterprise. Before we move over, obviously, one other item that's certainly important and sometimes becomes an afterthought is really like testing requirements and the overall evidence, right? So IT standards and software development standards internal to organizations today already have standards. And I obviously, as we start to bring automation and COE into our clients, the more that we can adopt and follow the norms, the testing norms within those organizations, the easier the adoption of RPA and process automation becomes. So I think with that, I'll hand it over to Matt from UiPath.
Sounds great. Sounds great, Kevin. Thanks. And before I get started, I want to introduce myself really quick. So I'm the product marketing lead for Test Suite, but I know that kind of marketing thing kind of scares people. So for the first 10 years before I got into marketing, I actually ran a test automation team, built a framework, and so I kind of understand kind of the way it works and everything, and why this kind of made a nice marriage between this role and what we're going to talk about today. So if we want to go to the next slide. All right, and so before I get started with the presentation, I want to kind of show you this as kind of a tangential video, but I kind of think about it as you know, when you're watching it, think about it as if you know, it could be applied to more of an automation enterprise automation situation. So ready to play.
I know when we see Falcon 9, we get to talk a lot about reusability. Everyone is very familiar with the first stage coming back down and how cool that looks. Dragon is also designed with some reusability. In fact, you've flown Dragon multiple times, or you've flown Dragons multiple times to the space station. How does reusability factor into Dragon's life cycle?
Yeah, so I'll actually talk a little bit about both, because one thing I think everyone always thinks about reusability and, hey, it saves money or that's great, but reusability actually improves your reliability. So when we get Falcons back and when we get Dragons back, either after one mission or multiple mission, we can do all these detailed inspections on them. And that's super important because when you fly a vehicle, you can only have so many sensors on it. You can't put a sensor, you know, every single inch of a rocket or a spacecraft.
And there's already way more than I think anybody realizes.
Exactly. But so, you know, especially for rockets that wind up in the ocean, some people don't have any idea of what they actually went through. So the fact that we get all the hardware back, we were able to inspect literally every square inch of it and make small design changes that actually improve reliability for the whole fleet. So even though Bob and Doug are on a brand new rocket and a brand new spacecraft, those spacecraft are actually more reliable based on the knowledge we've learned from reusability.
We've walked people through a lot of the new systems on Dragon.
So yeah, so I wanted to show you this because oh yeah, so that was the end of it. So because I was watching this with my son last summer when the first manned mission went up with SpaceX. And, you know, I saw this and I was like, wow, this is exactly what we're kind of trying to do at UiPath with enterprise or fully automated enterprise automation. And so that's one reason why we built UiPath, was to kind of expand beyond what, you know, RPA and extend into the testing world and even into the IT world, you know, as Kevin mentioned earlier, you know, is an important place for automation as well. And you know, at UiPath, one of the first things we did when we started to build Test Suite is we asked our customers, what makes your automations or your robots fragile? And I like to kind of point this out from the example of a real example. So let's think about an onboarding automation, which, you know, kind of everybody is familiar with, everybody gets onboarded, but there's lots of moving pieces. And so when we asked our customers what challenges they had, it kind of fell into three buckets. You know, and I think Kevin talked a little bit about this earlier, but the first one is, of course, building your workflow and your robot, you know, in a good way where, you know, when things change, when objects move, you know, when updates are made, you know, it can address those things. And so that's kind of things in the workflow itself. But then when we dug deeper, we also found that there's some problems when applications change underneath them. So if Workday has an update, or if SAP has a change, you know, will the robots keep working? And so that was another places where automations would break. Then the last one is environment changes. So environments change on a pretty ongoing basis. You know, patches are applied, and even just a small patch can take down a robot. And you're talking about environments, you know, internet connectivity to your SaaS providers. You're talking about internal servers, and so our automations going across all those things. So if we go to the next slide, when we start to scale this up and we have many robots, that was one robot, we begin to see if we are not building our robots in an appropriate way and we're not testing them appropriately, our teams are going to start to have to deal with a lot of maintenance. I kind of call this a whack-a-mole problem. So if you're putting out robots and you're having to kind of fix them on a regular basis, you know, you're playing whack-a-mole with your robots, and your team is then sucked into that and not and increasingly doing more maintenance when we really want them to do more, creating more robots. So if we go to the next slide, this is the kind of way we look at it, is that, applications changes quite frequently, like we talked about. Environments change a little bit less frequently. But what we found is that even though business processes tend to stay pretty stable, that these first two areas are impacting them. So, and they'll stack up on them. And then what our teams end up doing, like I mentioned before, is instead of continuously building new automations where they're sucked into continuous maintenance. So if we move to the next slide, really what we foresee is kind of shifting this left, so that we're addressing these problems earlier in the process, which all good testers understand. When you're finding issues earlier and you're addressing the issues earlier, then you're going to be you're going to have more stable and more higher quality outputs at the end. And so what we want to do is we built UiPath kind of to address both the RPA, the robot testing, and the application testing as well, which you'll see both of these things. And what those do is those two combine to create a low maintenance environment in production for your robots. And then if we go to the next slide, the other thing that we're looking at when we think about a fully automated enterprise, going beyond just RPA, we need to start looking at more of these, what Kevin talked about earlier is more of these collaborative processes, defining requirements, defining test requirements, adding a little bit more rigor into the process, but also kind of looking at a more collaborative approach. And so today the problem is that we have development and testing have their own automations, and IT has their own automations, and the business is now having their own automations with RPA. And what we see is all these silos of skills, silos of tools, silos of artifacts. What we want to do is have this one automation repository that everybody can use. And if we go back to the SpaceX example, imagine, if you compare a rocket to logging into SAP, if the same automation component can be used for all of those teams, how amazing would that be? If we go to the next slide, that kind of shows that. If we're all using the same platform, and if you imagine like the onboarding example as well, part of onboarding is going to be Active Directory. You're going to have to do something with Active Directory. You're going to have to set somebody up there, and IT probably already has something for that. And so what if everybody could use the same component for Active Directory, for example? And so that's what we're trying to get. And then also taking all the different skill sets of automation from the enterprise and sharing those best practices across the teams, because I think that's another thing that's sometimes overlooked. So if everybody's using the same technology, the same skill sets, and bringing their expertise, test automation for applications has been around for 20 plus years. So those guys can give us a lot of wisdom and feedback, and really improve the processes and share their experiences as well. So if we go to the next slide. So what does success look like for one of our customers? And so this is an example of one of our healthcare provider customers who is using UiPath to test some of their Citrix processes. And what this allowed them to do is they found that they're able to increase their test coverage by 2 to 3x, because what we're doing with UiPath is we're applying testing to both RPA as well as applying a production RPA set of tools to and going backwards into testing. And so some of our advanced capabilities like object recognition are going to really help improve that test coverage. And then also this customer was able to improve their release velocity by more than 2 months. And what this really netted down to is they had one robot that really did the work of 3 testers, which freed up their other testers to go do more exploratory testing or automate more test cases or package tests for customers, or do more value-added strategy and improvement work. So if you go to the next slide. So really, UiPath is kind of, our goal is now to enable the fully automated enterprise, and that's combining business, development, and IT operations in one platform. Next slide. And so really, the outcome of what UiPath Test Suite provides is the ability to scale automation. You know, as we mentioned, as Kevin mentioned earlier, you know, really, if you want to start scaling, you have to look at a more rigorous approach, and not necessarily rigorous as more process, but more of a continuous process. And so we see, you know, using sprints and using some of the agile methods that have become popular in software development, and applying those to RPA could really move the needle and help us build more resilient robots so that we're able to keep scaling. If we go to the next slide. And so this is kind of a view of the entire UiPath platform, which you may have seen before. And we kind of pull out Test Suite because it's a little, it crosses many phases. So it doesn't fall into one of these categories, as Kevin mentioned earlier. It kind of goes across the entire life cycle. And we kind of are starting to think of this as, you know, kind of as maintaining and watching over your automation health. And so making sure that your automations are healthy, that they're performing well, and you know, that we're, you know, able to add that governance component where it doesn't exist today. The next slide. And so this is how Test Suite is architected. So if we go from kind of on the right side, we have Studio Pro, which is really where you build the automations. Orchestrator is where you're orchestrating and executing your tests. So you create your tests once in Studio Pro that sit with your workflows. You deploy those to Orchestrator, where you can continuously run those tests even after you deploy them to production to make sure that things are still working. And then those tests are run by test robots. And then Test Manager is really the hub where you manage things like requirements. You could pull those in from other external tools like Jira, or we have integrations with SAP Solution Manager, Azure DevOps, and ServiceNow is coming soon as well. And Test Manager is also where you kind of can execute your tests. You can do those exploratory tests, and then also we support manual testing as well. So if we go to the next slide, and to kind of understand how, since we do kind of service two different types of teams, we have application testing teams and we have the RPA COE teams. And so the way that the tools map to those different roles is kind of shown here. Whereas a business analyst and manual tester on the application testing side, they would use Test Manager and Task Capture, you know, more regularly to do that. And then an RPA developer or test developer would use more of the build and studio and the orchestrator side and the more technical side of the house. And then everything is kind of ends up results in test robots that are going to be running your processes and testing your processes as well. Next slide. And now I'm going to turn over to Evan, and he's going to give you a demo.
Awesome. Thanks, Matt. Let me go ahead and share my screen here, and we will get started. Awesome. I think everybody should be able to see my screen now. And of course, what we're looking at is UiPath Studio Pro, which, as Matt just mentioned, is going to be the version of UiPath Studio that you would use to build these test automations. So to start with, we're going to kind of run through, you know, what the differences are here, look at some of the unique features, and then we'll go upstream into Orchestrator, Test Manager, and kind of see some of the reporting as well. So to start with, you know, I think one of the core differences we're looking at here compared to what we would see in Studio is that I'm not looking at a normal RPA sequence. What I'm looking at is called a test case. So if we look on the left side here, we'll see my RPA sequences have this little UI icon. Conversely, my test cases have this target icon, this bullseye icon associated with them. That's really representing how they're treated differently by Orchestrator and Test Manager upstream. It doesn't affect a whole lot about what we can do with them within Studio, but it's important to mark our test cases the right way so that it gets recognized by the rest of the system, right? Now, in front of us here is one of these test cases in particular, and we see kind of the common high-level structure of one of these test cases, which is something we call given, when, then. For those of you in the audience who, you know, have done testing before, who are sort of familiar with the space, you've probably seen this or you've seen something similar to it, but essentially the idea is given is going to be the steps I do to prepare to be ready to start testing. When is going to be the steps that are actually, you know, the ones I'm testing, essentially. And finally, in the then block is where we determine if our test is passed or failed based on the outcomes of the earlier steps. So for example here, this is a test of the UI double application, which looks like this. The given block basically is going to make sure the UI double application is open. The when block is going to interact with that application. In this case, going to type some numbers into it. And in the then block, we're going to determine if we're successful, which in this case is, did those numbers add up correctly in that UI double application? Because in this case, we are testing the application itself. This is really an application test. Now, to sort of take this up to the next level of complexity, though, we've got to think about, essentially with these numbers being hard-coded, how much value does that add to us? And I might argue that while it adds some, it doesn't add a whole lot of value as a test case, because it might be that this app only works for those exact numbers, or it could be there's a whole lot of things we might be missing with this particular test. So I want to look at a couple ways we can improve this test to have it basically cover more scenarios, be more variable, basically to be a better test all around. First thing I'll look at in that regard would be what's called data-driven testing. So I just hopped over one tab, and this test is basically the same test, except it's data-driven. And what we're going to see here is essentially, the given, when, then structure is still very much the same, but instead of those hard-coded numbers in the when block, we're now using some variables like cache in, on us, not on us, etc. Those variables are basically going to define for me where I pull numbers from when I want to run this test. So when I created this test as a data-driven test, I had to add a Excel spreadsheet. But now when I go to run that test, I can use basically any line in that Excel spreadsheet as a test scenario. So here, for example, I had 5 lines in my spreadsheet, and each one of these represents a set of values for cache in, on us, and not on us. If I run this on Orchestrator, it's automatically going to run all of those 5 scenarios. So kind of it's essentially going to cover as many scenarios as it can, essentially. Now, the other important thing we have in terms of data generation and management would really fall more on the generation side. So we've added some capabilities around creating random test data at runtime instead of defining test data beforehand as well. So if I want even a random address, I can just pull in this random address activity, pick my location if I want to, and then I'll get my address as an output. Similarly, I can do this with numbers, names, dates, even just random strings or random values. The real key here, of course, I wouldn't say is necessarily the capability of doing this, because in .NET we've always been able to create random numbers, sure. But I think the real advantage to these data creation activities is they're a lot easier to use, and they can also result in higher quality data than some of those more traditional approaches. Another really nice addition to Studio that we see here with Studio Pro would be our integration with Postman. For those of you who aren't familiar with Postman, Postman's one of, if not the most popular API integration, API testing tool in the world. Basically, it's just a very simple interface that allows us to build up API calls and test them out. What we've done with UiPath, though, is we've enabled the ability to basically take contents from Postman and to consume them into UiPath essentially as activities. So what we'll see here over on the left is if I go to my activities, I can look under Postman, and it's actually going to give me a list of calls that I've built in Postman. I was hoping I could show you what that looks like to build, but maybe Postman's being a little slow today. But essentially, I'm going to parameterize the different elements of the API call I want. And once I built that up in Postman, I can export it and import it into Studio, such that when I want to make a API call like this create loan call, I now just have the ability to just give raw inputs and get outputs back without having to worry about a lot of the complexities inherent to making an API call. So I don't have to worry about am I getting a response in JSON or XML? I don't have to worry about, how exactly I'm sending it or what I'm sending. All that's kind of been taken care of in Postman. And now I just get to kind of enjoy, having access to this API call and being able to very easily make it. One more capability that I don't think we'll have time to fully explore today, but I certainly wanted to call out, is that we are now also offering mobile application testing. So we partnered with Sauce Labs and Browser Stack to provide basically, mobile emulation. And then we're able to use Appium to basically automate on these emulated mobile devices. And in that way, now we can also test mobile applications, whether they're iOS or Android. Now, the last thing I want to show you really relates to how we're going to be moving upstream here, right? So if I go to my project here on the left, as we were mentioning earlier, my test cases are marked with these bullseyes. You'll see though that some of these bullseyes are gray and some of them are blue. The bullseyes that are gray essentially represent tests that are in what's called draft mode, meaning if I publish the rest of this project, my tests in draft mode will not be pushed onto Orchestrator. Conversely, the ones in blue are publishable tests, meaning that when I push this to Orchestrator, those tests will be reflected up there. What's really nice about this is this allows, our tests to kind of coexist in a project without getting in the way. So, in this case, right, if I'm writing 10 tests at once and only 5 of them are ready, I could just push up the 5 that are ready when they're ready and, worry about the other 5 later on. Or also, this has quite an important, I would say this is also a pretty core feature for RPA testing. So when we think about RPA testing, instead of wanting to test, a third-party application, we're actually wanting to test another workflow. I just jumped over here into an RPA project that has main.xaml as sort of its core workflow here. And I want to take a look at what it might look like to test this. As I was just saying, in this type of project, we're going to build the tests directly in there. We're not going to make a separate testing project because we already have an RPA project. So what I'll do is I'll find my XAML that I want to test. I'll right-click it, and I'll say Create Test Case. What that does is it'll automatically build a test case relating to that RPA for me. So let's take a look at this one that I just made, and we'll get an idea of what this might look like. So by default, it's going to give me my given, when, and then block, and it's also going to invoke whatever workflow I'm trying to test in the when block. As we were saying earlier, right, the when block is really whatever steps it is that are sort of doing the testing or that we want to test. So that's why we see the invoke going in the when block, because essentially that when block is the things we're testing, and because we're testing that RPA workflow, it goes in there. Now, to me, I would say one of the killer features here is what I can do in terms of seeing my test coverage. If I go to debug my test when I've got it here, this is of course going to run my RPA workflow locally because that's how essentially we're testing it. But we'll see here as I run through the steps, you may have noticed some of these steps actually turning yellow and then green in the background. What that's representing is what's called activity coverage. Activity coverage is basically saying, compared to, activity coverage is essentially saying how many steps of the workflow you're testing were hit by your test. So in this case, we hit 87% because we hit on all of these activities, except for this one log message on the right side of the if statement. Now, if I was a really good tester, what I'd probably do is I would probably write a couple more test cases to make sure I could hit 100% activity coverage. Or even on a more complex project, right, we might just try to get close. But essentially, activity coverage is going to be our North Star for knowing, approximately how much are we testing? Are we doing a good job right now or not? Are there big glaring things we're not testing that need to be checked out? Having taken a look at that, let's go ahead and look at pushing this upstream now. First thing I would do would of course to be mark these as publishable for whatever tests I want. And once I've done that, I can press the publish button at the top right of Studio. What that's going to do is it's going to move my tests up onto Orchestrator where we'll find them now. So if I go to testing on Orchestrator and go to test cases, I'm going to see a list of every available test case. And if I search for UI double, I'll be able to find my 3 test cases relating to that particular application. Now, if I want to actually run these, there's another step I'm going to have to carry out. I would say this is pretty similar to the production side, because on the production side, we've got, packages which need to be made into a process in order to be run. Similarly, our test cases need to be made into a test set in order to be run. So let's take a look at how that works. Here on my test sets menu, I can press this blue plus button at the top right, and that's going to enable me to create a new test set. So I can call it whatever I want, but I'll pick an environment from which I will pull one or multiple automation projects. In this case, I'll just select all three so we can see all of them, but it could just be one, it could be two, whatever, right? Once I get past that page, though, we're going to see now a list of every single test case available in those multiple projects. So this is a really cool feature, and this is another thing that kind of works alongside that draft versus publishable thing to make test cases easy to manage. But essentially, I can write two test cases in two completely different projects, and then use this test sets to be able to still run them together. So this one, for example, comes from CICD N&B. This one comes from UI double demo tests. It doesn't matter. I can mix and match them, run them together. It wouldn't stop me. Now, I've actually already created a test set, so let's go ahead and run that one instead of creating a new one here. And what we'll see is this test set has actually 7 tests in it. It has the very basic test I showed you at the beginning. It's got the data-driven test, which was the second test we looked at. That's going to run 5 iterations because there's 5 different variations we provided. And then lastly, my very last test is one I just wrote so it would fail. And you guys could see what it looks like when a test fails in UiPath. Awesome. So we're coming up on, I think, the last data-driven one here in just a second. And then we are going to see that that final one happen as well. Okay, so this test which fails should fail out in just a second here. Beautiful. So if I close this down now, we're going to see a list of 7 tests, 6 passes, 1 failure. On the past ones, I can, of course, look at things like my logging, when it stopped and it started. But I can also view what's called the assertion, which is going to basically show me, hey, what exactly were we testing and what was the outcome of that? So here, this was the actual, particular thing I was trying to verify. And then it also gives me a screenshot of what was going on my screen at the time to try to help me, understand really what that was or why that happened. Now, I would definitely be remiss, though, if I talked about test results without talking about Test Manager, because while Orchestrator does do a good job of keeping this all in a pretty organized manner, I'd say that Test Manager is really the way we want to think about our requirements and our results. In Test Manager, we essentially start with what's called a requirement. This is basically something the business wants. And this can either come in from a third-party system like Jira or Azure DevOps, basically get automatically created, like when a Jira story is created, for example. Or we can decide to create one of these directly within Test Manager. Either way, once our requirement's in the system, we're able to assign test cases to it. So if I go to this one here, for example, we're going to see a list of 3 test cases that have been assigned to it. And there's more up here, or rather I could add more up here, either existing ones, ones that I've already built, or ones that are completely new. I could just define on the fly and say, hey, that's a new test case for this now as well. Either way, this collection of test cases basically being mapped to the requirement is going to determine sort of what relies on what in order to be running. It's also worth noting that we can, provide some tagging or things like that to keep these test cases and these requirements, further organized or easy to search, right? Now, the other thing here, though, is when I drill on one of these test cases, like this one here, for example, we'll see that this is actually a failed execution, right? So once again, I see my log data. Once again, I see my screenshot kind of telling me what went wrong. But I've also now got the ability to push content back to the original system from which I got the requirement. So if I was hooked up to Jira, or well, actually, in fact, I am hooked up to Jira. So let's do it. If I press create defect here, this is going to go ahead and in my Jira, it's going to automatically open up a new defect card, basically saying, hey, there's a problem with this specific test case. Kind of here's why. And then it's also going to tie it back to all of the other stories or all the other requirements that are associated to that test case. So not only is it going to update me on, whatever story I happen to be testing that day, but it's also going to update me on older ones that just happen to have been affected as well. That way, whenever there's a bug or a defect, we have a really, full picture of what's going on, why things are breaking, and we can do more to repair it, right? I have one other topic I wanted to touch on here, and then I think I'll be passing it back. But I wanted to talk a little bit about continuous integration, continuous development pipelines, because I think this is another really important element of what we can bring to the table, right? I actually don't believe I specifically show this, but in Orchestrator, we have the ability to schedule our test sets, right? So if we want to run our test set at a certain time of day, every day, that's really our simple way of doing that. Now, while that can do a lot, and I think there's certain scenarios where that really makes a lot of sense, I also think that continuous integration can be a really powerful tool in our toolkit. So what CICD tools let us do is basically, instead of running at a fixed time, what if we ran tests sort of right when we needed them? So as soon as my code got updated, I run the test to test that code, right? Essentially, we can do this with Jenkins, with Azure DevOps, and basically what's going to happen is when we see our source code getting updated, either on the system we're testing or on the code we're actually building, we can have Jenkins automatically trigger it. So Jenkins or Azure DevOps. So in this case, for example, I pushed some code, and so it automatically just ran through this job, which in this case basically checked out my code from the repository, packaged it up, ran it to test it to basically make sure it works, and then because it worked, it was willing to deploy it to my actual orchestrator, and then I was able to see my results about that on there. What's nice, right, is we've got a pretty tight integration here. So if I want to build up a pipeline like this myself, I actually, not knowing a whole lot about CICD, I actually did build this pipeline in about half an hour. Essentially, we can just put it together like building blocks, and we've got different components that basically let you slot together different sorts of steps you might want to do. So yeah, I would say really to sum it all up, right? Test Suite, especially in terms of a technology perspective, shares a lot of DNA with our other products. Studio Pro is very close to Studio. Our Orchestrator is absolutely the same platform, and I think a lot of reusability and a lot of the same concepts that apply to core UiPath definitely apply to testing. I think what we're really bringing to the table that makes the Test Suite a little different is the reporting, the managing, and sort of some of these quality of life features like CICD that we see being really popular among testers. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Evan. All right, if we go to the next slide, we're going to wrap up a little bit. So that was a great demo. I think kind of you covered almost all these areas. But kind of the goal, the vision of Test Suite and what we're trying to accomplish is that we're not just going to do RPA testing and we're going to do application testing. We really want them to be kind of an integrated process and part of the continuous testing life cycle that testing teams have used for a while now, for the last 10 or 15 years. And so you can see Test Suite allows us to do not only the RPA testing, but it also allows you to do the functional integration regression testing as well. And that's important as well because when a component changes like Workday, you may want to, looking at it from a complete testing perspective, you may want to do a smoke test on the application itself. And then run your RPA scripts so that you can get a report of potential things that might break because of an update from Workday. So if we go to the next slide. So really the ultimate here is, and Evan ended on this, and I'm glad he did, because really when we look at the ultimate goal of this, if test teams and RPA teams use this in concert in a coordinated fashion, what's possible is that we can set up triggers in Orchestrator to look for changes happening in Azure DevOps or Jenkins are two examples. Then run the relevant RPA and application test sets. And then eventually on the right-hand side here, using the test manager dashboard, our RPA teams and our test teams can go out and do preventative maintenance, so that before something breaks in production, or an RPA breaks in production, a robot breaks in production, you're able to see what's potentially gonna break, excuse me, before it impacts production. So you don't have that that chaos, when something comes down and you have to get the team scrambling to maintain it. You can do that ahead of time, so you have headlights into what's coming in the future. So if we go to the next slide, going back to the onboarding example I started off the presentation with, what Test Suite allows you to do is really to mitigate all of these issues. Probably not ever 100%. Testing is never 100% coverage, but you're going to be able to cover a lot of these areas to create more resilient robots, and make them more resilient to changes and environment updates. And so that's really what our goal is with Test Suite in the long term. And then the next slide. And really what we're looking at is creating a world-class continuous automation practice for a fully automated enterprise. And that, like I mentioned earlier, is not only with the RPA team, but extending into the IT operations, development teams, enterprise teams, including citizen developers, so that then they're all using the same platform, which allows you to centralize that governance and have a common approach. It allows you to create those resilient robots, which I've covered quite a bit. And then also covering that reuse piece that we talked about, with the SpaceX example, so that people can reuse automation, so that even the citizen developers in the organization can reuse these components as well. And all of this allows you to scale faster by sharing skills, experience, and the automation components across the enterprise. And then also something else I didn't mention earlier, but I really want to, it's an important point, is by organizing your automations around the business processes really aligns the organization around the processes that are running your business. So whereas testing in the past, the application testing team may have been kind of siloed, and all they're doing is looking at Workday to see if it works. But now, if they're working with the RPA team, now they can kind of look at it more holistically in the context of how the business uses it, so that they can really be testing in doing more risk-based testing based on the actual business processes running the business. And so that's another important point. And with that, we have a lot of resources to look at. If you want to go to our landing page on UiPath.com, you can kind of get the idea of what Test Suite is and what it's about. We also have free training on Academy, so you can go out into Academy and get trained on Studio Pro and Test Suite for free. And then we have I think we have about 30 videos now on YouTube that Evan touched on a little bit of what Test Suite does, but there is so much more that it does. SAP testing, Citrix testing, getting a deeper dive on the RPA testing. We have several videos out there. So go out there and really explore that and kind of get to know the capabilities a little bit more. And with that, I think turn it back over.
Perfect. Matt, I appreciate that. Evan, thank you very much for going through that demonstration and kind of giving some information. So I think at this point, I'm going to, let me unmute the attendees here, and allow for maybe a few questions from the group. So maybe I'll start out then. As we kind of think about like compatibility and versioning with UiPath Studio and Orchestrator, is Is there a specific version that Test Suite is compatible with, or is it?
So Test Suite was introduced as part of our 20.4 release. So 20.4 or newer is compatible with Test Suite. The only other caveat right now is that it does require a on-premise or third-party cloud orchestrator, although it'll be available on all orchestrators soon in the future.
Good. Any questions from some of our attendees here? Okay, so maybe a couple more questions on my side. So I think we saw that there's definitely a reusability component to this, and maybe a little bit deeper into kind of the technical side of things does the test cases that we create within Studio Pro, do those travel with the XAML file?
Yeah, absolutely. So, just because it's even code written in Studio Pro, right, doesn't mean it couldn't be code you might run as part of a process, So I think a lot of customers we've seen being successful with this really are double dipping, right, both on the test side and the production side, because you can either, take elements of your production automations and then use those as a starting point for tests, or even, as you're saying, kind of go the other way, right? Take some tests and then say, hey, actually, these components right here can be used on the production side. And that's going to cut a month off our development for something that's going to bring a lot of value.
And another important point on that is as you mentioned, when you create your test cases as you're building your workflows, the thing that we sometimes don't emphasize enough is that those do travel to orchestrator, and you can set up test sets, and like Evan talked about earlier, you can schedule those to run like on a daily basis, or you can schedule those to be triggered if something underlying changes that is going to impact that robot. It can run, you can automatically run your test cases for that workflow. So like I mentioned earlier, so you get those headlights of things that could potentially be broken before when the next version of an application or an environment change comes out.
Very good. That's definitely a big component there. So maybe a final question. Obviously we're talking about the kind of the RPA suite here and how it kind of crosses some of the silos of different capabilities. Is there a longer vision to Test Suite, maybe expanded beyond just kind of RPA or UiPath?
So yeah, we are looking at kind of looking at ahead. We're thinking about not only just the testing piece of it, but as you mentioned earlier, there's a lot of governance pieces that we think are going to be needed. The RPA, development market is maturing pretty rapidly, and I think some customers are doing it, but it's not consistently being done. And so what we're looking at doing in the next year or so is coming out with something called automation ops. And so it's kind of the cousin of DevOps. And so we're looking at how those two can kind of coordinate together to really build this, kind of digital pipeline that crosses over not just development operations, but also in the business, and making sure that whole pipeline and governance piece is all coordinated.
That's great. Perfect.